Hello. Welcome to Phantom Homicide. Today we are focusing on a deep dive into the extraordinary petition for commutation of sentence filed by Pamela Smart. This is a case really frozen in time, isn't it? Vilified by the media for decades. It's a story of murder, sensationalism, and ultimately a desperate plea for mercy.
That's exactly right. And that tension is what we're exploring today. Our mission is very focused. We are going to unpack this, well, mountainous stack of sources surrounding Pamela Smart's request for clemency. We're talking about the request made to the New Hampshire governor and executive council, and this isn't just, reviewing an old conviction.
No, it feels much deeper than that.
It is. It's about a really forensic scrutiny of the documents. We're looking at her defense arguments, decades of her conduct after the conviction, and what the petition calls profound alleged injustices that, frankly, poisoned the atmosphere of her 1991 trial.
And the core event, the reason we're here, is the murder of her husband, Greg Smart. She was convicted specifically of accomplice to first-degree murder for that tragic event back on May 4th, 1990, in Derry, New Hampshire.
Right. And here's the huge moral and, frankly, legal challenge at the heart of all this. Pamela Smart received a sentence of life without the possibility of parole.
Essentially, death in prison.
Exactly. A death sentence served over decades. Yet, and this is crucial, the confessed actual killers, the men who physically held Greg Smart down and shot him.
Bill Flynn, Vance Latime, Patrick Randall, the names everyone remembers.
Those men and others involved have all been released or paroled. Flynn, Latime, Randall, they're out. So we're diving deep into these sources today to try and understand how the justice system could possibly create such a horrific disparity.
Okay, let's start where the whole tragedy really began, with Pamela Smart's own acknowledged catastrophic choice. She was very young, just 22 years old. And according to her own statements in these sources, she made what she calls the worst mistake of her life. This involved briefly becoming romantically involved with Bill Flynn. He was, 15 or 16? A young man she knew through her work. She was a facilitator, a volunteer, in something called Project Self-Esteem.
Yeah, and it's really critical here to understand let's say, the very narrow scope of guilt she has ever accepted, according to these documents.
Okay.
She has accepted blame and guilt, but specifically because, in her words, her poor judgment in having that relationship set into motion a series of events that ultimately resulted in Greg's death.
So she accepts a kind of moral responsibility for the sequence of events starting.
Precisely. She takes responsibility for that initial bad decision, the relationship itself, but the line she has absolutely never crossed, and this was the central conflict of the entire trial,
Is the denial of the core crime. She denies being involved in the murder itself.
Absolutely. 100%. She maintains she never wanted Greg murdered. Never asked Flynn to do it. Her story consistently, from the trial through to this petition, has been that she ended the relationship with Flynn.
And he acted alone.
That's her claim. That he acted entirely on his own accord, maybe out of desperation, maybe rejection, maybe fear of losing her attention completely, but that it was his decision, his action. That's the bedrock of her defense, then and now.
So let's get into the details of the murder itself. The execution, based on the timeline presented in these sources. What exactly happened that night, May 1st, 1990?
Well, the plan as it was carried out was deliberately orchestrated to look like a random burglary gone wrong at the Smart home.
Right, the classic staging.
Yeah.
Exactly. 4 young men were involved. Bill Flynn, Vance Latime Jr., a guy named Randy Fowler, and Patrick Randall. How do they split the roles?
Latime and Fowler, they waited outside. They were in the getaway car. Flynn and Randall were the ones who actually went inside the apartment. They entered, and they waited for Greg Smart to come home from work.
And the sources describe the execution as, cold and brutal.
They do. The violence is detailed with a chilling specificity. Once Greg was home, Flynn and Randall ambushed him. They forced him down onto his knees.
Just terrible.
Randall held Greg down, pinned him. The sources say he physically restrained him with a knife, while Bill Flynn executed Greg, shot him once in the head. The actual physical acts of lethal violence were committed solely by those two men, Flynn and Randall.
Okay, so this brings us right back to that core conflict presented to the jury. Yeah, the prosecution's narrative built almost entirely around Bill Flynn's testimony, painting Pam Smart as this cold, manipulative mastermind. Flynn claimed he had to kill Greg Smart if his relationship with Pamela was going to continue. and that she actively helped plan the whole thing.
It was, almost a textbook example of a prosecution using really potent emotional levers, sex, power dynamics, the older woman, the younger boy, to convince a jury that she was the true evil genius behind it all.
Right.
The defense, on the other hand, argued Flynn acted entirely on his own initiative after Smart told him it was over. The whole case really hinged on who the jury believed. On the credibility of Bill Flynn, a 16-year-old kid confessing to murder, but pointing the ultimate finger at his former lover to, well, likely escape a life sentence himself.
And that credibility assessment, as you mentioned, it happened under this absolute crushing weight of public opinion. This is where the dark irony really kicks in, isn't it?
It really is. The sources describe Smart as being instantly, and I mean instantly, vilified, ridiculed, and sensationalized by a scandal-thirsty media.
Just reduced immediately to that one terrible lapse in judgment, her worst mistake.
And branded publicly with a mark of shame right away. The sources really emphasize that this instantaneous, overwhelming media frenzy didn't just report on the crime, it actively created an atmosphere of absolute prejudice.
Which influenced everything that followed.
Profoundly influenced the entire environment surrounding her conviction. At age 22, it was just this perfect storm of genuine tragedy and runaway sensationalism.
Perfect storm feels exactly right. Let's dig into that media spectacle because it sounds like it was far from just background noise.
Oh, it was the main event. These sources make it incredibly clear. The Smart trial was, and this is a quote, the first in the nation gavel-to-gavel media coverage of a trial, televised as entertainment.
The first. Televised as entertainment. That's terrifying, actually, setting that kind of precedent.
It really set the stage for what we now sort of recognize as media circus justice. And think about the scale of it. Even before the trial officially started, a local New Hampshire news station ran a full 30-minute special titled Anatomy of a Murder.
Wow. So shaping public opinion before a single witness was even sworn in.
Exactly. Pre-trial contamination on a massive scale. And it didn't stop there. It actually escalated during the trial.
How so?
Mid-trial, the Boston Herald newspaper actually held a reader poll asking people if they thought she was guilty.
You're kidding? A poll mid-trial?
Curiously. And the results were just devastating for the defense. Over 80% of the readers polled, including people right there in the local New Hampshire community, said they believed she was guilty. This was before she had even started presenting her defense case.
How can any defense lawyer possibly combat that level of prejudgment?
Well, the argument is they couldn't. And the sources also point a pretty sharp finger at the judge, detailing what they call judicial folly.
That's correct.
Judge Gray, yes. Far from trying to shield the judicial process from all this media contamination, he reportedly announced, quote, I hope Clint Eastwood plays me in the movie.
Oh, come on.
That's what the sources claim. It suggests, maybe an active desire for fame over ensuring judicial propriety. It led a New Hampshire lawyer, writing later, to lament that Judge Gray decided to, quote, throw open the courtroom doors at the last minute without thoughtful deliberation and assessment of the impact. That kind of ego can really transform a search for truth into just public spectacle.
And the negative impact of that spectacle, it spilled right into the jury room, didn't it? Particularly when it came to the sentence.
Yes, absolutely. The sentencing was mandatory in this case. First-degree murder accomplice meant life without parole, period.
No room for nuance, none. And the sources show that the jurors really struggled with this. They questioned the sentence precisely because they understood the legislative mandate meant they couldn't consider the specific circumstances of the crime or Smart's, alleged ancillary role when deciding her fate. It was just a stark binary choice. Guilty, which meant death in prison, or innocent, meaning she walks free. And the reaction from the jury after the verdict described in the sources is just haunting.
It really is. One juror is quoted lamenting that the sentence simply doesn't feel fair. Another recalled that there wasn't a dry eye in that jury room when the mandatory sentence was announced. They felt complicit, it seems, in delivering a punishment they saw as disproportionate.
But there's an even more profound statement from one juror in these documents, isn't there? About potentially hanging the jury.
Yes. This is maybe the most stunning revelation regarding the jury's internal conflict. One juror stated, on the record later, that had she known beforehand about the mandatory life without parole sentence for a non-shooter accomplice, she was, quote, 99% sure that she would have hung that jury.
Wow. 99% sure.
That's not just regret. That indicates the mandatory sentence itself, especially when contrasted with the fact that the actual killers could get parole, introduced such profound doubt that it might have actually prevented a unanimous conviction altogether.
The trial flaws just keep piling up. Let's talk about the witnesses, the key witnesses, the 4 young men involved. The court failed to sequester them. Or the jury.
Neither. Neither the jury nor the key witnesses were sequestered, and for the witnesses, this created this colossal opportunity for them to coordinate their testimony.
It sounds like it went beyond just an opportunity, though.
Oh, it was actively enabled, according to these sources. Flynn, Latime, and Randall apparently watched each other's testimony on television while they were being held together in the court's holding pen.
They watched each other testify on TV. That's the claim. And perhaps even more damning, Vance Latime and Bill Flynn were actually cellmates in jail before and during the trial. Cellmates. The 2 main accusers.
Yes. This gave them, quote, an unfettered opportunity to align their stories. It allowed them to ensure they presented this seamless, potentially rehearsed front against Pamela Smart.
And they weren't just talking to each other. They were reading the news coverage, too.
Diligent students of the press, apparently. The sources confirm that between court days, all 3 of them, Flynn, Latime, Randall, were reading newspaper articles about the trial, specifically about Latime's testimony, and then discussing the details together. They were essentially, it seems, curating their narrative based on both public reporting and their internal discussions.
That level of coordination has to cast serious doubt on the reliability of their original testimony.
You'd think so. And this ties directly into evidence that was suppressed or came out later. The defense was actually denied the chance to re-examine Flynn and Latime about letters they had written, letters the jury never got to see or hear about.
What was in those letters? What did they reveal?
Well, they cast staggering doubt on Flynn's integrity, for one. In one letter, Flynn apparently bragged about the murder, and he wrote, this is a direct quote mentioned, that the Attorney General was afraid I'll get on the stand and say she's innocent.
He wrote that?
Yeah.
That the AG was afraid he'd say she was innocent?
Yes.
Yeah, and he concluded the thought by writing, it was either her or us. That phrase, her or us, strongly suggests the entire prosecution might have been built on this coerced binary choice. Either the boys go down for first-degree murder, or they successfully blame Pam Smart.
Incredible. And there was corroboration from another participant later.
Yes, Robert Fowler, who was one of the 4 men involved but didn't testify at the trial, stated later that the other 3, Flynn, Latime, Randall, would not have provided the same testimony if they hadn't been confined together and had the chance to match their stories.
And there were even allegations of drug use. There's an affidavit mentioned in the sources alleging that both Flynn and Randall were actually using marijuana and cocaine right before they testified, which, if true, adds yet another layer of haze over their recollection and overall credibility. This is just a cascade of issues. Which brings us to the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, those infamous audio takes, the conversations between Pam Smart and Cecilia Pierce. If the prosecution hinged on this, why do the sources suggest this evidence was so fatally flawed? Well, the technical problems were apparently debilitating, almost unusable according to some accounts. Juror Karen Sicard described the tapes flat out as having unbelievable poor quality.
And the police detective acknowledged issues.
Detective Pelletier himself admitted on the stand there were ups, fallouts, a hum in the system, and moments where the conversation just got lower or was lost entirely.
The sources mention a technical term, tape skewing. What does that actually mean for someone listening to it?
Tape skewing basically happens when the magnetic tape itself doesn't move smoothly across the playback head in the machine. It gets distorted. And the state's own audio expert testified that he had to physically mess with the playback head. The sources specifically mention using a screwdriver just to recover parts of the audio.
He had to use a screwdriver on the tape player
to try and force it to play correctly. So imagine trying to make a life or death decision based on audio evidence that required physical tools just to be partially heard. It sounds like fundamentally compromised evidence.
But the manipulation didn't stop with the poor audio quality, did it? The transcripts. It seems like where the trial structure really failed.
Utterly failed, according to this petition. Okay, so written transcripts were prepared. But they were prepared exclusively by the state. And apparently they sometimes inaccurately attributed words spoken by Cecilia Pierce to Pamela Smart.
Wait. They put Pierce's words in Smart's mouth on the transcript. That's the allegation. And here's the kicker. These transcripts were given to the jury to use during their deliberations. But crucially, the transcripts themselves were not officially entered into evidence, so the jury used documents that weren't evidence to help them decide.
Exactly. And jurors later admitted that without those transcripts, which essentially filled in all the blanks left by the terrible audio quality, they, quote, wouldn't have known half of what was said. So arguably, the jury convicted her not based strictly on the audible evidence they heard, but on the state's interpretation of that evidence. provided in a non-evidentiary document.
That's deeply troubling. And finally, in this section on the trial, let's quickly address that false narrative the prosecution pushed about sexual innocence.
Mm-hmm.
It was incredibly effective in swaying public opinion, wasn't it? Insidious and powerful. The narrative they crafted was Pam Smart, the older, predatory teacher, using sex as a weapon to entice this supposedly innocent virgin student Bill Flynn into committing murder for her. But the facts were different.
Entirely different, as revealed later. First, Smart wasn't Flynn's teacher. She was the public affairs coordinator for the school district. A staff member, yes, but not his classroom teacher. More importantly, Flynn was emphatically not a virgin.
He admitted that later.
He did. He later admitted to an investigator that while he told Pam he was a virgin, probably, to gain sympathy or attention, it simply wasn't true. So this whole manufactured image of a calculating monster manipulating a sexually innocent boy was just fabricated. Designed purely, it seems, to override any legal doubt the jury might have had with sheer moral outrage.
So we've moved from a trial just saturated with media frenzy, potential judicial ego, questionable sentencing impacts, clearly coordinated witness testimony, and deeply flawed evidence to the stark reality of her life since that conviction.
Yeah, the sources make a sharp transition here from just the chaos of that courtroom drama to the cold, hard reality of maximum security. After her conviction, she served 2 years in Goffstown, New Hampshire. Then she was moved out of state to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. That's a maximum security prison for women. And she's been there now for, nearly 3 decades, almost 30 years, completely cut off from her New Hampshire family, friends, her community. It's not just incarceration. The petition frames it as a kind of banishment.
And her time inside hasn't just been, doing time. It's been marked by some absolutely unimaginable physical and emotional trauma, far beyond what you might even expect in maximum security.
The suffering detailed in these petition documents it's brutal. In 1996, Pamela Smart was severely beaten by 2 other inmates, attacked.
How badly was she hurt?
The physical cost was permanent. She sustained an orbital fracture, that's the bone around the eye. She had nerves severed in her face. She required surgery to insert a permanent plastic plate in her face.
Permanent damage.
Permanent. She still suffers, to this day, from a permanent loss of feeling on the entire left side of her face. And she requires daily pain medication just to manage it, decades later.
But there's a moment here related to that attack that really stands out in the petition, something that speaks to her character, especially in the context of asking for clemency.
Yes, it's quite remarkable. When her attackers were eventually caught, convicted of second-degree assault, and they faced additional criminal prosecution for the attack, Pamela Smart herself asked the court not to add any extra prison time to their sentences.
She asked for mercy for the women who beat her so severely.
She did. That act of grace, asking for leniency for the very people who inflicted permanent, painful damage on her, it speaks volumes, the petition argues, about her capacity for forgiveness and basic humanity, even while she herself was serving a sentence that offered absolutely no hope of release.
But the trauma didn't end there. It actually involved a betrayal by the very institution that was supposed to be guarding her.
Yeah, this part is incredibly disturbing. Smart reported that she was sexually assaulted and exploited by a male prison guard.
Assaulted by a guard, yes. And he apparently used the ultimate threat against her. He warned her that he would kill her parents if she ever spoke about what he was doing. My God.
He then coerced her, forced her into posing for salacious, inappropriate photographs. He used a camera and tripod that he smuggled into the prison. He and his common-law wife then took these coerced photos, concocted a completely false story about a supposed prison sex and drug ring, and sold the entire package to the National Enquirer.
For money, just to profit from her notoriety.
Exactly. Pure exploitation, designed solely to profit from her name and further destroy her reputation, painting her as deviant even within prison.
And what happened when she finally reported this guard? Was she protected?
Protected? No, quite the opposite.
Yeah.
The retaliation was immediate and severe, according to the sources. She was placed in solitary confinement, the whole.
For reporting the assault?
For reporting the assault and exploitation. She was stripped of her prison job, lost her privileges, and then she was charged with serious prison infractions, things like smuggling contraband and falsely publicizing a scandal. They essentially tried to blame the victim for the guard's criminal actions.
How long was she in solitary?
She endured 2 harrowing months in solitary confinement, isolated, during which time her health, both physical and mental, declined alarmingly.
But this story, this particular darkness, It did eventually lead to some form of vindication for her, didn't it?
It did, but it was a long, hard fight within the prison system. After appealing the internal disciplinary charges, her conviction on those charges was eventually overturned, and the charges were completely expunged from her prison record.
And the tabloid story.
The National Enquirer itself provided written confirmation that Pamela Smart was not the source of the story or the photos they published, and later she actually won a favorable settlement in federal court for the damages she suffered related to the prison's cover-up of the guards' exploitation. So, yes, vindication came, but only after this protracted, exhausting battle that just demonstrates her resilience, really, in the face of what sounds like institutional malice.
So despite all this trauma, despite serving what she calls a living death sentence, maybe her greatest achievement, the thing most highlighted in the clemency petition, has been her dedication to education and teaching inside prison. It reads like a profound narrative of self-made hope.
The documentation of her transformation over the decades is, well, it's extraordinary. She apparently vowed early on to make a difference in this dark prison, despite having no prospect of release.
And she pursued higher education.
Intensely. She earned not one but two master's degrees while incarcerated, both with perfect 4.0 GPAs, both summa cum laude. She relied entirely on private scholarships to do it. She got a Master of Science in Law in 2001, and then a Master of Fine Arts in English Literature in 2003. She was even named class valedictorian for that one.
That's remarkable academic achievement under any circumstances, let alone in maximum security. But she didn't just keep that knowledge for herself, did she?
No, that's the key point. She immediately began to reinvest it back into the inmate population. For more than 2 decades now, she has been consistently, dedicatedly tutoring and teaching fellow inmates.
In what areas?
Across the board. Adult basic education, pre-GED prep, GED classes, pre-college work, even actual college-level classes offered within the prison. Her core belief reflected throughout these sources is that education is fundamental, that it lessens recidivism. And that's a crucial point when you're arguing for commutation.
And the impact she's had on the lives of other inmates, that seems to be perhaps the most compelling character reference in this entire petition.
The testimonials included are genuinely moving. You read accounts. For example, one inmate who apparently struggled significantly with mental illness and was housed on a specialized unit called the Network Unit.
Oh.
She described Pam Smart acting as an inmate aide who would literally calm her down during psychotic episodes, talk her out of self-harming, sometimes feed her when she couldn't feed herself, help her write letters to her children, even act as a liaison with the medical staff to help stabilize her medication.
Wow. That's profound personal care.
And that particular woman eventually earned her GED, crediting Pam's help. Another inmate directly credits Pam Smart for helping her achieve an associate's degree and, quote, saving her life from deep depression, noting that Pam has always been there for me or anyone for that matter.
That kind of selfless dedication.
Yeah.
It even earned her a pretty powerful, if unofficial, title, Inside Bedford Hills.
Yes, several supporters quoted in the petition actually compared her tireless service to being like the Mother Teresa of Bedford Hills.
High praise indeed. And her service went beyond just education.
Much broader. She served as a peer facilitator in the prison's AIDS Counseling and Education Office, the ACE office. That involved in-depth certification. She ran support groups on HIV/AIDS, STDs, women's health issues, really tending to the most vulnerable populations.
And leadership roles, too.
Yes. She was elected president of the Inmate Liaison Committee, the ILC, which meant working directly with the prison administration to articulate inmate concerns and issues. She was also deeply involved in arts programs like rehabilitation through the arts, RTA, acting, singing, dancing, and productions. One mentioned was The Wiz, performed at the United Nations. She was appointed leader of the church's liturgical dance ministry as well. Her official prison progress reports consistently back this up, describing her as very reliable, cooperative, disciplined, and consistently rating her overall attitude and behavior as superior above average.
Okay, so when you take this whole record, the decades of transformation, the service, the academic achievement, and you place it against the backdrop of the original crime and trial, that central injustice, the sentencing disparity, becomes almost impossible to ignore. Really does. It becomes the elephant in the room, and it's the ultimate argument for why clemency is being sought now. Let's just state it plainly again. The two men who physically entered Greg Smart's home, who held him down and who pulled the trigger, Bill Flynn and Patrick Randall.
They are now free, out on parole. Bill Flynn, the actual shooter, was released from prison by the time he was 45 years old. Raymond Fowler, another one of the 4 men involved that night, he's also free on parole.
And Pamela Smart? The alleged planner, the person convicted as an accomplice, the one who did not physically restrain Greg or pull the trigger?
She remains incarcerated, still serving that sentence of life without the possibility of parole. She is serving, as the petition puts it, a living death sentence, while the active participants in the physical act of murder are living free lives outside prison walls.
It's a shocking contrast.
It is. And the sources quote one supporter who really crystallized the perceived inequity. They said, even if Pam is guilty, she should be released upon time served. Mark Chapman, who killed John Lennon and Charles Manson, have been up for parole, and they were guilty of killing people. The point being, the system has somehow treated the non-lethal accomplice in this case far more harshly than the actual executioners.
So, given this stark disparity and the trial flaws we discussed, why is executive clemency seen as the appropriate fix now if the courts didn't address it?
Well, the sources define the role of clemency perfectly here. Pardons and commutations are described as constitutional, executive fail-safe mechanisms for justice.
Fail-safe mechanisms.
Yeah.
Exactly. They exist specifically outside the often rigid constraints of legislative mandates, like mandatory sentencing laws, and also outside the limitations of traditional judicial review, which often gets bogged down in procedural issues. Clemency allows the executive branch, the governor and council in this case, to conduct a holistic, humane examination of the individual person, not just the original crime. It asks, does this punishment still serve justice decades later? And this idea isn't just theoretical, right? It's been reinforced by some major shifts in legal thinking, particularly around maturity and sentencing.
Precisely. You look at the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark rulings in Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana. Those cases rejected mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles.
Because kids are different.
Because the adolescent brain is still developing, it's recognized as being less culpable and, crucially, more capable of profound change and rehabilitation. Now, okay, Pamela Smart was 22 at the time of the crime, not technically a juvenile. But the scientific community often places the age for full brain maturity, particularly regarding impulse control and long-term consequence assessment, closer to 25 or 26. So she was very close to that threshold. And a mandatory life without parole sentence, which inherently removes the entire rehabilitative goal of punishment and basically deems the offender beyond redemption from day one. Well, that contradicts the whole philosophy of change, especially when applied to relatively young adults.
The petition also makes a strong case using precedents, doesn't it? Showing that other governors in very similar situations have stepped in to correct exactly this kind of sentencing disparity.
Yes, Appendix C of the petition is filled with these examples. They're crucial evidence that this isn't some unprecedented request. Take Maryland, for instance. Governor Robert Ehrlich commuted the life sentence of a man named Walter Arvinger.
What were the circumstances there?
Arvinger was basically just a bystander during a fatal deeding. He didn't wield the weapon. But he got life while the actual person who delivered the fatal blows had already been released. The governor intervened specifically because of that disproportionate punishment for the person with the lesser role.
And there are similar examples involving female accomplices, like Smart.
Definitely. In Missouri, Governor Bob Holden commuted Shirley Lute's life without parole sentence. She had helped her son kill her abusive husband. She was released after serving 25 years.
Okay.
Pennsylvania has multiple relevant cases. Governors Ed Rendell and Tom Wolf both commuted the sentences of accomplices, guys like Keith O. Smith, who was just a lookout, and Tyrone Wirtz, the getaway driver. These men got the same life sentences as the actual killers, and the governors stepped in to correct that imbalance after decades served.
The New York example involving Judith Clark seems particularly relevant, maybe the most contemporary one cited.
It is very relevant. Judith Clark was the getaway driver in a notorious Brinks robbery and murder case from the 80s. She received a sentence of 75 years to life, but Governor Andrew Cuomo commuted her sentence a few years ago.
And what was his reasoning?
He explicitly cited her exceptional self-development during her decades in prison and the sheer length of the sentence she had already served. The legal and moral argument being made for Pamela Smart is virtually identical, if not arguably stronger. If people with clear lethal involvement, like Flynn and Randall, are released, and if high-profile getaway drivers like Judith Clark can be commuted based on rehabilitation, then surely the argument goes, Pamela Smart, the alleged planner who never touched the victim, deserves the same consideration after nearly 30 years of exemplary conduct and service. It does seem compelling, but it begs the question. If there were so many clear errors back at the trial, the media circus, the witness coordination, the shock over the mandatory sentence, why couldn't the regular judicial system, the appeals courts, fix this years ago? Yeah, it's a fair question, and the explanation is, well, it's frustratingly technical, but really essential to understanding why clemency is the focus now. Most of those profound trial errors we've discussed, the overwhelming media influence, the potential judicial misconduct, the failure to sequester witnesses they weren't properly legally preserved for appellate review.
Meaning the defense didn't object correctly at the time, or the courts just wouldn't look at it.
Could be either, or both. Either the objections weren't made in the precise way required by court rules at that specific moment during the trial, or the appellate courts later simply refused to review those issues, perhaps citing procedural defaults or applying restrictive standards of review that were common at the time.
So the doors for traditional judicial correction slammed shut based on procedure, not necessarily on the actual merits of whether the trial was fair.
That's exactly the argument being made. And crucially, much of the really compelling exculpatory information evidence that points away from guilt or undermines the prosecution's case only came to light after those judicial avenues were already foreclosed.
Like what, specifically?
Well, the full details about the co-defendants coordinating their testimony, those specific allegations of their drug use right before testifying, and the discovery of Flynn's damning letters where he literally wrote, "It was either her or us." Much of this was discovered, or fully investigated and vetted, only after the normal appeal windows had closed. So, clemency is presented here as truly the last and maybe the only remaining resort for correcting systemic errors that the judicial process either wasn't equipped to handle back then or simply refused to acknowledge due to procedural barriers.
What's also fascinating looking through these materials is how some figures who were initially part of or associated with the whole media sensationalization are now actually offering support for her release.
Yeah, the shift in perspective from some quarters is palpable. You have Joyce Maynard, the novelist. Her book, To Die For, was famously inspired by the Smart Case and became that movie starring Nicole Kidman.
Right, which probably cemented the negative image for a lot of people.
Exactly, but Maynard herself wrote a letter included in this petition, making it very clear that her novel was fiction, loosely inspired, yes, but not a factual account of the Pamela Smart case, and she states that she trusts the governor will give Pamela Smart the same second chance granted the others involved. She's actively trying to help dismantle that fictionalized monster image that has haunted Smart for so long.
And there's also a striking admission of, well, shame from someone within the New Hampshire legal community itself.
Yes, a New Hampshire lawyer wrote a really powerful letter. It's included here. He admits feeling profound shame about the whole affair, noting how easily people, including himself, were manipulated by the media. He actually apologizes for being, quote, duped like so many other unsuspecting fools.
Yeah, that's quite an admission from a lawyer.
It's a stunning internal critique of the trial environment. It directly confirms the defense's long-standing argument about the patent unfairness of the proceedings, which this lawyer partly attributes to Judge Gray's alleged judicial egotism and folly. It's just a shocking acknowledgement from within the system that, in this specific instance, justice may have succumbed to spectacle.
And even small personal details from back then are being re-examined. The media famously created this image of her as the cold, calculating ice princess immediately after the murder. But personal testimony contradicts that entirely.
It does. Tracy Paris, who was a friend of both Pamela and Greg Smart back then, provided testimony for this petition. She stated that Pamela was absolutely hysterically crying and completely inconsolable in the immediate aftermath of the murder. That directly contradicts all those contemporary media reports that painted her as strangely calm or cool.
And Paris also addressed those infamous bathing suit pictures.
Yes, another key piece of the prosecution's narrative was that Pam gave suggestive photos to young Bill Flynn. Tracy Paris clarifies that she took those bathing suit pictures of Pam, and it was for a modeling seminar Pam was considering attending. Nothing to do with giving them to Bill Flynn. It just rips apart another element of that manufactured seduction narrative that was so effective at trial.
And technologically, there's still this tantalizing possibility hanging out there. The central piece of physical evidence, those flawed audio tapes, could potentially be clarified today.
Right. An audio engineer provided a statement asserting that with modern digital audio workstation, or DIW software, it's now possible to effectively remove much of the background noise, the electrical hum, and maybe even mitigate some of the distortion caused by that tape skewing we discussed earlier.
So we could actually hear what was said more clearly now.
Potentially. Back in 1991, the jury had to rely on those inaccurate, non-evidentiary transcripts because the actual audio was practically inaccessible. Today, the possibility of achieving a much more objective, clearer listen exists. And that technological advance further underscores, the petition argues, why clemency needs to consider factors that simply weren't available to the original trial court or jury.
Finally, in this section, we really have to acknowledge the immense personal burden this whole decades-long saga has placed on Pamela Smart's family, particularly her mother.
Absolutely. Linda Wojos, her mother, has spent decades campaigning tirelessly, relentlessly to vindicate her daughter. The sources describe years and years of pain, public scrutiny, and misery she has endured fighting for this cause.
And it's important to note, the petition emphasizes the unwavering belief of Pamela's parents, who were also Greg Smart's in-laws. Remember that Pamela had, quote, no part in his death. Their sustained belief in her innocence right from the start and through all these years, despite the overwhelming media condemnation, carries significant emotional weight in this plea for commutation. Okay, so stepping back from the trial and the past traumas, what is the overall portrait of Pamela Smart, the inmate, that emerges from these sources after nearly 30 years inside the maximum security system?
The portrait painted is consistently that of a model inmate, someone who, despite having a sentence explicitly designed to offer no hope, has somehow maximized her potential and dedicated herself to constructive pursuits. She's described repeatedly as exceptionally intelligent, spiritual, maintaining a positive attitude against all odds, and deeply dedicated to helping other inmates.
Having every reason to be bitter, yet choosing a different path.
Exactly. And the institutional recognition seems overwhelming based on these documents. The honor floor reference forms, which are official prison evaluations, repeatedly praise her character. They use terms like very reliable, cooperative, disciplined. One evaluator specifically calls her an outstanding tutor, saying she's one of the very best tutors I have had in my program over the past 20 years.
High praise from within the system itself.
Very high. Her respect for authority, her cooperation in all areas, it's uniformly noted in progress reports as being superior or above average. There doesn't seem to be any record of significant disciplinary issues beyond that retaliatory incident involving the guard, which was ultimately expunged.
And looking towards the future, if she were released, she actually has a concrete plan for reintegration, a job offer.
She does. Benjamin Joannou Sr., who is the president of a company called J&B Importers, Inc., has formally submitted a letter offering to employ Pamela Smart immediately if her sentence is commuted.
And what's his reasoning?
He argues quite explicitly that he believes she would be a very productive, contributing member of society. And he adds significantly that he believes she would be of no threat to anyone. So the appeal isn't just framed as asking for mercy for past deeds, it's also arguing for the restoration of a potentially valuable resource back to society.
So it all comes down to this final imploration for mercy. It seems to hinge on the history of the flawed trial, her documented character transformation, and just the basic, stark mathematics of the sentences served.
Precisely. The core injustice, that unavoidable fact Pamela Smart serving a living death sentence while the confessed murderers walk free, is presented as fundamentally morally unacceptable. When you consider the sheer amount of time served, nearly 3 decades, her profound and consistently documented rehabilitation, and the broad consensus reflected in these documents that she poses no threat, mercy is presented as the only just recourse left.
The disparity is just horrific, as the petition states. It is. And as one supporter eloquently put it, quoting Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, it's perhaps time for the executive branch to demonstrate that the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven. The concluding assessment throughout these documents is clear. She is not a threat. She never has been a threat since her incarceration began, and she never will be. Instead, she's presented as an untapped resource, capable of contributing positively if given the chance. Well, this deep dive has certainly peeled back the layers on the Pamela Smart case. We've explored the incredible influence of sensationalized media coverage, the arguments about profound judicial failures during the trial, the decades of trauma and remarkable personal transformation during incarceration. And it all culminates really in confronting that undeniable, frankly shocking sentencing disparity that seems to cry out for some kind of executive intervention.
It really does. And this case forces us, I think, to confront the very purpose of long-term sentencing, especially mandatory life sentences. We've seen that the power of clemency is specifically designed, constitutionally, to act as a potential corrective mechanism when the traditional legal path fails, often because of those rigid mandatory sentencing laws, or because severe trial defects weren't properly preserved for appeal years ago. So the question this case really raises for all of us, for you listening, is this. When a judicial process is so undeniably flawed, as argued here, and when a human being demonstrates literally decades of undeniable positive transformation. Should the state prioritize continued vengeance for the original crime, or should it exercise mercy for the individual who stands before them today?
Okay, so we hope you liked our today's discussion. For more such discussions, subscribe to our channel, Phantom Homicide.